Okay, everyone, we're live.
Okay, this is a special meeting of the Board of Education. It's November 30th. We have a quorum. It's 6:03. This is a special meeting to actually go through our 10-year enrollment projections. This evening, it's a bit different than we've done it in years past. In years past, we've had Malone and McBroom do our enrollment projections each year. Malone and McBroom merged with SLR. SLR is not doing enrollment projections anymore. So this year, what we have is we have two firms doing our enrollment projection. One is Nasdaq. Nasdaq was involved in doing our enrollment projections years ago before we went to Malone and McBroom. And so they'll be up first doing their projections. And after Nasdaq is done, we have Mike Zuba, previously of Malone and McBroom, now with SLAM, providing their 10-year projections. I think we're lucky this year to have two firms doing it, which this is not a typical year. There's a lot of anomalies this year, so I think we'll, by having two firms do it, I think we'll learn a little bit more about the anomaly in that COVID brought to us in terms of housing starts and home sales and births and people moving in and out of town, and how that's going to persist in terms of our enrollment projections in the future. So I think it's good to have two to compare at least. So I guess first up is Karen Ledoux from Nasdaq. We'll have her kind of give her presentation, then we'll go to Mike Zuba from SLAM. So I don't know, Dan, do you want to let Karen in?
Sure, doing that now.
Okay, great.
Okay, Karen's connected.
Hello, Karen.
Karen, you may have to unmute yourself.
Okay, it finally worked. I'm sorry, it wasn't working. Good evening.
Good evening. Hi, Karen. This is Tony Pesco, the board chair. The special meeting of the Board of Ed to go through our enrollment projections. I think we're happy to have Nasdaq do our enrollment projections this year. I know it's been a while since we've collaborated on this, but it's glad to have you back doing this for us. I don't know if Lisa, if you have Lisa is the superintendent. We have other administrators. We have the building principals, and we have the rest of the board here. And looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Yes, thank you so much, Karen. We really appreciate your availability this evening and look forward to hearing you present your findings. I have told the principals that they can shut off their cameras if they prefer, because they will be actively listening. So I just wanted to state that. But we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
It's okay to start then. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm going to share my screen. Oops. Excuse me. It just takes a few minutes to share. Can everybody see?
Yep.
Okay. So I'll start the slideshow. Just a little bit background of Nasdaq. I don't know how many of you know Nasdaq. It started 75 years ago out of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And we're problem solvers for districts, public school districts in the New England area. We do executive searches. We do obviously enrollment projections, demographies, facility studies, sped trend reports, professional development, and overall consulting. So we're pleased to be here with the Weston Public Schools, the Board of Education, and any community members that may be listening in. This evening, I'm going to review the projected enrollments, review the projections in depth, and discuss some variables that influence the enrollment projections. First of all, I think it's important to go over our enrollment projection methodology, and in the presentation, also the report that was sent to the district, this is listed in there, but I think it's important to look it over again. We use a modified cohort survival method component technique, and that may not mean a lot to you, but we consider district specific information, such as the
Karen, can I interrupt you for 1 second? Is there any chance you can put your slides up full on the screen? We're seeing your presenter's notes and everything on there. I'm not sure whether that's fine for you, but we just wondered, as the slides get smaller, if you could hit slideshow, or, you know, I'm not sure.
Is it okay now?
Not yet. Anyone else? Am I the only one seeing all the?
No, we're seeing it as well. I think, Karen, I think what Taffy's asking is if you can go full screen down near the bottom right corner of your screen where it says 66%, the icon just to the left, but then you're not going to see your own notes, so it might not be.
I don't need to see them, but let me get back to full screen for.
It doesn't matter to me, as long as everyone can see properly. It's fine for me. I just didn't.
I actually can't get, because I am showing from the beginning, but you're not seeing that.
That's right. I think probably because you're sharing just one portion of your, when you hit screen share, you just hit one thing, one tab. Anyway, doesn't matter to me. Carry on.
It's fine.
And how is this now?
Perfect.
That's it.
There we go.
Okay, just one little button. You know how that goes. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the modified cohort survival method component technique, we assume the figures given by the district, the K-12 figures and the pre-K figures, are as accurate, and they're consistent from year to year. We use October 1 data from 1 year to October 1 data to the next year. We consider the district specific information, such as in and out of migration of students, the resident births, and the HUD reported building permits. We calculate percentages. We look at 10 years of historical data, and you'll see that in just a second. And we calculate percentages by year, by grade. So we determine a ratio of increase or decrease based on your enrollments from year to year by grade. And that's the key factor in the reliability of the projections, assuming that validity. So it's not wholly computer driven, but it certainly takes into account 3 sets of eyes at Nasdaq look at these projections to assure the reasonableness of what we have presented. So that reliability is something we get asked a lot about. Generally, it's reliable most in time when it's closest to the current year. And due to COVID, we are saying to districts, look just 1 to 3 years out, maybe 4, maybe 5. We've given you 10 years because that sort of can look at trends, but it's important to look at 1 to 3 years. It's based obviously on the kids who are currently in the district and those who are born into the community, but not yet old enough to be in school. So those newborns all the way up to those students who are about to turn 5. The least reliable category is looking at the number of births, say for 20 and 21 and beyond. We look at the births and we project the birth to kindergarten ratio, and that's the least reliable, but we work in concert with districts to be able to figure out if we're actually doing a good job of projecting those kindergarten enrollments. So there are factors that influence the enrollment projections. The birth to kindergarten ratios, and I'll talk in depth about these, the in-migrations of students in grades 1 through 8, and real estate sales. So the birth to kindergarten ratio, we look at, since 1980, Weston has enrolled more kindergartners than indicated by the births recorded. And we call that move-ins of students. So families move to Weston to enroll their students into school. So for example, over the past 10 years, the number of net move-ins has far exceeded the births of additional kindergarten students. So for 2021 to 22, and we'll look at that chart in just a second, there were 54 births recorded, but you enrolled 126 kindergartners. That's 72 more kindergartners who enrolled than were indicated by the births. We do have districts that the births equal the kindergarten. We have districts where the births the kindergarten numbers are lower than the births. So this Weston continues over the 10 years that we looked at to experience an increased number of net move-ins of families with students. So look at this. Look at this chart. It shows you the births in the solid blue line and then the kindergarten enrollment. And historically, since 2011, and I'm assuming even before, you've seen families moving to Weston to enroll their children and not necessarily have been born there. So that's the birth to kindergarten relationship. The second thing that I want to talk about is in-migration of students. So when we think about this, the number of families moving to Weston don't always just have students who are, after their birth or up to age 5, they could be any age. What we do notice is that the families moving to Weston over the past 8 years, you've averaged in grades 1 through 8. So that looks at grades 1 through 8 for the school year 2021. And then who enrolled in school in grades, 1 through 7, who enrolled in grades 2 through 8 the following year. And on average, you have 42 additional students who move in. So we look at that average over those 8 years. And for school year 2021, you had 37 additional students moved in. So the range of additional net move-ins that get to that average of 42 is between 30 and 57. So for families are moving to Weston, certainly the reputation of the schools, but it also could be attributed, and we're finding this with many districts along sort of the New York border, or families that are fleeing from what they feel is a more congested environment, so an urban setting. So that it could be flight from the COVID pandemic. It could be families that have now noticed that maybe they could live in a larger home in a larger area. So that's an important thing to consider. What we do know over the past, I've been at Nasdaq doing this for 4 years, and before me others, once families move and enroll their children, they stay. So that's an important thing to consider. So that in-migration of students, we're seeing additional kindergartners enroll as it relates to the births. We're seeing additional in-migration of students from grades 1 to 7 to 2 to 8. So the impact of real estate sales on enrollment. We use the Warren Group to look back sort of anecdotally over the past, using the data over the past 10 years. And what we have noticed is that the number of real estate sales is more important than the number of building permits. So people will say, oh, I saw this new development come in. It's the real estate sales that may have a bigger impact on enrollment. So for an average, 173 single family homes were sold annually from 2013 to 2020. But last year alone, there were 277 single family homes sold. And you can see that obviously that is an increase of about 100 than over the average. And through September of 2021, 177 single family homes had been sold. So families, again, with school-age children are moving to Weston. We find that 70% of those families contain elementary school children, 20% are middle school, and 10% are high school. So there's minimal impact, because families do not want to uproot their children. And that the median sales price has increased to $950,000. So it's important to know that we look at the real estate sales only as it relates to the Warren Group information. We don't interview realtors. That's part of a separate project that would be a demographic study, which is an in-depth interview with realtors and an in-depth conversation with the planning board. So now let's look at the historical enrollment, and I want to explain this chart to you, and I'll use my cursor. So this column talks about the birth year, which I had mentioned to you. It also looks at the 54 that students who were born in 2016, and shows you that kindergarten had 120 6 students enroll for the 21-22 school year. And then you look across the top, here's the school year, and here's pre-K all the way to 12, the K to 12 enrollments and the pre-K to 12 enrollments. And you can look, and so looking at the way we plot out each year and how students progress through the system. The historical enrollment and grade combinations is important to look at. What are some of the trends over the past 10 years for K to 2, 3 to 5, 6 to 8, and 9 through 12? And this talks specifically about the historical percentage of change over time. So over the past 10 years at K to 2, the enrollment has decreased by 69 students. At grades 3 to 5, it's decreased by 101. For grades 6 to 8, it's decreased by 88. And for grades 9 to 12, it's increased by 4, because you see as students progress through the grades, you're going to see some of the lower numbers shift, and there'll be higher 12th graders who are then part of your school system. This next chart just shows you in a bar graph exactly what has happened over time. So the projected enrollment, which is the important part of why we're here this evening, you can look at the same chart over time, noticing the births. We know that in 2021, there were 59 births and you enrolled 158 students for the school year. Am I looking at, no, here it is, sorry. 148 students for the school year 21-22. You can see that we have estimated the births, and this is where the conversation I had about the reliability of the numbers. We're estimating. These births are recorded through the Connecticut Department of Public Health, so that we estimate as we go forward, and then we look to a birth to kindergarten ratio to choose that, because we don't have any data to go by other than what it has. And then when you look at the K to 12, you can see the progression. When I look at the projected enrollments and grade combinations, in particular, and again, we're looking at over the next 3 years, because that's the most reliable. You can look at the 10 years for advanced planning or thinking about what's next for your district. But here, over the next 3 years, K to 2 is projected to increase by 33 students. 3 to 5 is projected to increase by 52. 6 to 8 is projected to decrease by 29, and 9 to 12 by 20. And again, this same chart, same information, only by total enrollment and not by grade. We have added something different this year, which you'll see here. It's by grade span. So you can look at the K to 5, 6 to 8, and 9 to 12. We group a K to 5 knowing that it's elementary, and that doesn't represent your K to 2, 3 to 5 enrollment, but it looks overall at what's considered elementary. And then here's the historical and projected enrollments by grade span, including the actual enrollment numbers. So again, what do those projections tell us? K to 2 enrollments are projected to decrease, while grades 3 and 5 are projected to increase. 6 to 8 and 9 to 12 are projected to decrease, but moderately, in my mind, is what I would say. We also include additional data, because this is some of the things that we look at in order to determine, are there some variability in the enrollment projections? Now, we only look at building permits as they are reported by the Housing and Urban Development. These building permit numbers are sent by the town of Weston to HUD. So it's the accuracy of the data is dependent on who has reported the data. So you can see here, it's ranged in 8 to 10, 8 to 11. So you've already seen what single family building might be doing to the area, and it's minimal. As I said, it's real estate sales. And the other data, the enrollment history, the residents and non-public, was not reported by the district, thus you don't see it here. There are a number of 39 homeschool students, and those are tracked for potential return to the districts, and then other areas there, the tuitioned in. And here I have put again the enrollment summary from the past that is part of the report, and I spoke to most of these things this evening. So I thank you for your time as we explore these enrollment projections and certainly open up to any questions you might have.
Maybe we can go back to the full screen now.
So I won't screen share anymore?
Yeah, stop
Okay.
sharing, and then we'll basically just
Okay. There you go.
perfect, great. Yeah, maybe I can start with a couple of questions. Kind of one kind of bigger picture question. In one of the presentations that were, I guess, sent, you don't have the slide here, but you show Connecticut over the last 10 years as an average of 9.5% enrollment decline. We're 10%, we're about there. But there are districts that I know, I'm not going to name them, some are worse, some have seen a bigger enrollment decline, and some are much better, seem less. Kind of, can you talk a little bit about the characteristics of the communities that maybe have seen a larger enrollment decline versus the average versus one that have done better than the average? Are there anything that stand out to you in terms of the characteristics of the community in any way that kind of can inform us as to why some have seen much worse and some have seen a lot better?
So there aren't that many during COVID that are much better, believe it or not, in Connecticut. Most of them with a profile like Weston. And
Yeah.
let me say that out first. With a profile like Weston, are seeing, between a 6 and 10% decline in population. And for some reason, Connecticut over the past 5 years has seen that decline. What we do see is that a lot of urban areas are seeing larger declines. Even some rural areas are seeing more increased enrollments because people are moving to vacation homes and those types of things. So the trends across New England are similar, but the rate of decline in Connecticut has historically been at that same 9% rate. And I actually, I know it's part of the actual report that was sent to the district. So Connecticut is seeing the largest decline of the 6 New England states. And, I don't really have an answer as to why. You need to look at each individual town.
Yeah. Okay. And the other question I have is, we have one data point last year, which is a bit of an anomaly. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, which is that from what you're seeing is the the birth to K kind of ratio for that 1 year has gone up. It was around 2, but for this last year, it's probably around 2.4 or so. Now, how much does that one data point persist in your enrollment projections? How important is this one data point that we're seeing versus all of the other past data points in terms of projecting the next 3 to 5 years? How much weight does it have? And I guess I'm wondering, what I'm wondering is, how much does an anomaly actually weigh, or maybe it is an anomaly, but how much does one data point actually weigh your projections over the next 3 to 5 years?
So that one, about 2.3% increase from birth to K is 1 point. We don't take 1 point. We'll take an average of 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, up to 6 years. And in the case of Weston, we looked carefully. So your 3-year average, your 4-year average, and your actually 6-year average is in the 2% range of increase. So we look at those and we choose carefully what ratio we use for birth to kindergarten. Next year, we'll know whether it was accurate to have chosen that particular ratio. And we'll certainly have that conversation with the superintendent as the next school year begins. Does that explain it? Thank
you. And I have actually one more question. We're seeing a unexpected decrease in high school, in the high school population, 9 to 12. How much of that is just the cohort progressing through the system, and how much of it is kind of out migration that's really not something that's incorporated in your, in your analysis? predicting out, an out migration is not something that you really look at, right?
Not at the high school level, because usually when students enroll in high school, they stay. So
Yeah.
your question as to the unexpected decrease, part of it is the cohort progressing. Part of it could be that families at the 10th grade would choose a private school. I don't see that too often. Your 8 to 9, you usually retain all of your 8th graders into 9th graders. So I'm going to surmise it's the cohort progressing, which is making the numbers decrease. You have over the past 3 years seen some decline of students, but we're projecting that you'll keep all of your 8th to 9th graders next year. So that's my take on it, and that's what we look at. We do know that at the high school level, your high school building principal probably is the best person to discuss that with, because they know the families in particular and can understand what are some of the reasons other than the cohort is declining. And that person can also tell you, I know I had 300 9th graders next, but I only have I had 300 10th graders, but I only have to say 280 9th graders coming in. So you can see that decline. You'd have to look at each of those grade levels.
One of the things that's helpful for us, and that's a good point, Karen, is that when someone leaves the district, there's a form, and as the former principal, I used to sign off on it. Ms. Cavoni does now, and it will say like reason for leaving. And I remember anecdotally, I went through to look to get a sense, and what we did see, because we are a small district and we know our families, people moving to other parts of the country, for example. I can think, and Ms. Cavoni is shaking her head. I don't know if she has anything to add, but people that are leaving, like not moving to the next state, but we're going to Florida, we're going to Georgia, we're going to Illinois, for example.
It could be work related. Yes, we have heard some of those, but those are in between. So there are reasons, and thank you. That's very helpful to hear from the former leader of the high school who would know that information.
Let me open it up to questions that other board members might have, or the administration.
Sure. I have a few questions for you. Karen, first, thanks for this presentation and the materials you sent in advance. I think, here in Weston, we're looking at a kind of a comprehensive analysis of our facilities. So, when I look at a lot of these numbers, what I'm really trying to understand is the story behind them, right? I want to kind of pressure test some of the assumptions that are built in to these numbers, because, we're in this kind of unprecedented environment right now with COVID, and we're seeing effects in our town that may not be what we've seen historically, right? You had the slide you pointed to where our home sales are up 100 homes as to where they had been historically. So, prior to COVID, we'd been in a pretty continuous enrollment decline, but then we're now seeing these home sale increases. So, what I'm interested in is, what kinds of studies or focus groups or analysis have you or your industry done to better understand whether these are long-term trends or short-term COVID bubbles? What's happening with young families and urban versus suburban living? I mean, are you seeing any trends there that are impacted specifically by COVID, or do you have reason to believe that these might be longer term decisions? And then related to that, also, wondering here specific to Weston, prior to COVID, our home values had decreased to the point that many of our older residents in town were unable or unwilling to sell their homes because it would have resulted in a substantial loss. So now that we've had these home prices rise, as you saw in your own slides, to pre-recessionary levels, do we have an understanding as to whether these residents have sold their homes and moved away, or that they're holding on to their homes in anticipation of further profit? Those are the kinds of things I'm thinking about, in terms of the people that are moving into town. Are these second home buyers and, putting their kids into schools here in Weston temporarily with the intent maybe to put them back in Manhattan when things settle down, or are they here for good? I don't know that all of these home sales are necessarily going to result in enrollment increases either in a short-term or long-term projection. I know it's a lot of questions, but I think what I'm really interested in is kind of the analysis behind it, or your help in helping us learn and educate ourselves and figure out how to get the answers to these questions if your firm doesn't do this type of work. Thank you.
So for the enrollment projections report that I just gave, we do not do that type of work, but we do enrollment forecasts where we will interview, and that's a separate project for a separate fee. So that's my little, just as a caveat in case that is something you would like to do. It is district specific, so I want to say that. But what we have noticed in the 300 and something districts that Nasdaq works with across the 6 New England states, we are seeing what we call boomers who have waited because the real estate market tanked, and they waited for the real estate prices to come back up. And this trend started probably 2 or 3 years ago, so prior to COVID. They would finally put their houses on the market and they would move. And what we do know is that if you're going to buy a 3 or 4 bedroom home, most of the time, those families are going to have children. We can't know how many how many boomers have sold their homes and how many families of millennials or Gen X or whatever they are have moved in, because we can't get that data from anyone. We can get it anecdotally through a demographic study, but it's truly anecdotal. So we do know that they're moving in, and where those boomers are going, some are moving to apartments within the same community, some are moving to smaller homes, and some are moving out. So they're gone, but the tax base remains the same to fund the schools, and you're having more families move in. So the impact over time, I think you have to put aside the 100 additional average homes for this school this year and know that over the past 7 years, you've had an average of 177 homes sold, and you have absorbed those students over those 7 years, and you are still seeing moderate decreases over time, correct? So that's it's really very complex. So is this new 277 homes a short-term bubble? I would suggest yes. I think, but again, a new variant was discussed last evening. So I honestly think that over the past 2 years, those who are moving out of Manhattan have moved. And they've moved to Weston and some of your surrounding towns. Do I think a portion of them might say to themselves, I'll go back, but once you enroll your children in school, that's the research we've seen and our experience, people stay unless a work event, a life event, something shifts. So once you have them, they usually stay. Your home values decrease, but now you're seeing them increase. A part of it is because of that bubble, because of COVID and people looking for homes. But from this point on, I think I'm hoping for stability, but I had hoped for that stability for this year and we didn't get it. So I think I answered all of your questions, but please let me know if there's something else.
No, I think that's fine. Thank you.
I have a question. Thanks for your report. Do you have any insight into what would potentially, why there would be less families moving into a town? Is there outside of the schools, are there things that families are looking for today insofar as what towns provide versus bigger cities, that is considered in your report when you look at a decreased enrollment?
We do not, but you can intuitively understand that if somebody is moving out of a smaller apartment into a larger home, that's an important aspect. So it's really life events that shift people and thinking about it. I have a niece who's in Manhattan, just moved to Burlington, Vermont, because she now has 2 children and can work remotely. So what's the draw? Family. What's the draw for somebody who, it's me from the state of Massachusetts thinking, I'm going to move to Weston, Connecticut. I'm going to look at the proximity to recreation, proximity to medical doctors, proximity to, in addition to the schools, but to shopping, those types of things. And is it the type of community that supports who I am and my values? And that's certainly personal. So, you know, when you think anecdotally about why people move to Weston, you know, your realtors could tell you more about the lens as to why they're coming.
Okay, so I think that's the basis of my question. And you mentioned, you said your daughter moved from Brooklyn to Burlington, Vermont. So do you have any data that looks at what, I guess it's a two-part question, right? So we have COVID, which is what is hopefully going to be a blip, right? Hopefully, you know, we go back to some level of normalcy, although it seems like we keep pushing level of normalcy out 6 months at a time. But if you look at the declining enrollment is not new to Weston, and it doesn't seem to be new, as you mentioned, to Connecticut in general. So do you have anything that a town like Weston could focus on or look at that would potentially explain maybe what Weston doesn't have that a town nearby does have that would be more attractive to a family? Or conversely, what smaller towns like Weston could be offering other than the education that would potentially attract more families?
Well, as I said, it's really truly personally based. It's where do I want to go? Is it proximity to family? Is it proximity to faith-based organizations? Is it proximity to I can work remotely, so do I have reliable Wi-Fi? All of those things. So to think about what Weston might do in order to support how to get more families to move in is something that I think has to happen in collaboration with the town side. To look at I don't know if you have a town manager or a mayor or what the structure is there. And I know that in one district I worked in Natick, Massachusetts, we did a strategic plan that encompassed all of those people to talk about how do we support not only families moving in our residential, but how do we support commercial? So it's something to think about internally. It's nothing that I could specifically say for Weston.
Right. That's not factored in any way or considered within the purview of what you're kind of reporting on to us.
No, it is not.
Okay. Thank you.
Karen, I have a quick question. First of all, thank you as well for your presentation. Great insight, but I'm curious. Part of me feels as if we're asking you to look into a crystal ball, right? And tell us what's going to happen, because we all want to know. But my question for you is the information that you received regarding people who moved in during this time period. Did you get any specifics as far as demographic information concerning these people? And the reason I ask is, for example, we're talking about projected birth rates moving forward. Are we looking at young couples who have one child or young couples without children? Are we looking at people who have children that have moved in, you know, middle school, high school? So, I mean, is that sort of information, do you have that sort of information so you can factor that into your projected birth rates? I guess if it's young couples without children who are planning to start families, moving out of the city, et cetera. Do you have any of that information?
There's no way for us to get that. We don't know. So okay. It's Weston specific. But what we do know is you trend. You have 50 students. The birth rate is 50 students, and you enroll more, 72 more, so 120 something more. I don't have the exact numbers in my head. So that trend continues. I don't see it shifting over the past 10 years, and it's not unlike some of the districts near you.
And so the projected decrease in enrollment in K-5 is a mystery to me then, if we have had 250 families plus in 2020 move in and another 177 so far in 2021. And yet there's a decrease in enrollment you're projecting for 3 years. And like Sharon, I'm thinking, okay, these are new families with babies and they're all coming in. Like we can expect a bulge in enrollment as a result of this enormous number of new families, but yet your projections say something else. Am I missing something?
Well, those families move in with students from ages potentially 0 to 18.
Yeah.
And they may have college-age students and have moved to Weston to flee the city. So that we're looking over time at your enrollments in those grades and then projecting out and saying we're going to look at a 2% increase, twofold increase in the number of births to be the number of kindergartners that you will see. So some of those families that move in, there aren't even school-age children yet. So you have to look 5 years out, 4 years out, and
Right.
over time. So say 100 3 to 4 bedroom homes probably yield. I think it's maybe 15 students, 15 to 17 students. I'd have to look at the data even more carefully. So when you think about it, there's a lot of things, a lot of factors.
Yeah.
So for us, I think, I don't know, I don't have last year to look at to think about what was the decline. So I don't have it. So
Okay.
it's, when we work with other districts, we do have that.
Yeah.
So I can see, has the declined? And maybe there's a moderate look at how the enrollments will continue. But you can see on the historical and projected line chart, you can see, you go up and down and you're sort of stabilizing over the past 5 years. So continue to look at that. But it sometimes feels like a crystal ball, but we are always looking at how many births were there, what did you enroll, and we look at that 1 year ratio, 1 year average, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 year average, and look at it to figure out what's the best reliable projection for Weston at this time. And we won't know until next year how reliable it was or accurate.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Karen. Just piggybacking off of that idea, the idea of the COVID factor and the reliability of the data. And I know you've said that in the 1 to 3 year, the data is more reliable. And as we go out, it becomes, more unpredictable as more factors change. Do you think that with COVID, we can look at the 10-year projections the same way we've looked at 10-year projections in the past? Or do you think there's more possibility of unreliability of the data as we look at how the pandemic plays out over time? As a district, we've looked at the 10-year ratios and factored in that reliability factor. Can we use that same logic now, or should we add in a little bit more, room for consideration?
So I'm advising districts to think about that room for consideration, because I am not sure about what next year will bring. I do believe that people who have moved and are there. So those students are enrolled. So I'm hoping for some consistency and stability over the next year or two. But 1 to 2 years of COVID is not considered a reliable data point to draw any conclusions. So we are truly telling districts. We used to always say, look at the 10 years, see what's going to happen over the next 10. But we are no longer doing that until there's more stability globally and nationally.
Yeah. Karen, just as an aside, 20% of our housing stock has turned over in the last 2 years. It's hard to believe that you're going to see that same kind of momentum in the next 2 years. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think so, but I don't know exactly.
Karen, I have one more question. I don't think it was covered. Do your when you study the demographics of what's going on in most of the other Connecticut towns similar to ours, and you see a lot of this, as Tony just said, 20% of our housing stock changed hands, and then enrollments decreasing, at least at the moment, you kind of shake your head. Is it that families are not coming in with school-age kids, or, which is essentially my question, are you seeing any trends where families are moving into the more, smaller towns because they have flexibility, but they are not enrolling their children in the public schools? They're potentially enrolling them into either a private school or they're educating them at home. Are you seeing any trends that would potentially explain a lot of in-migration, but not a bump in enrollment.
We have seen an increase in families homeschooling during the first year of the COVID pandemic and continuing this year with the uncertainty. To the extent that that is happening at Weston, we only have the 1 year of data for homeschool. And I'm trying to find my little piece of paper. I had written them down, and you have, maybe 39 students, I'll find it, that are homeschooled. It's that last data. So the district will continue to, yes, it's 39, will continue to monitor those students. But I think that those who have moved are going to either enroll their kids or not, and you would have known by now. I don't know that you'll have that much more turnover of housing stock in the next year, but we can't predict. So it's a wishy-washy answer to something that we just don't have any understanding of.
But do you know if if there's a decrease of enrollment, for example, in Weston Public Schools, do you have any knowledge of potentially increased enrollment in private schools and preparatory types of schools where the numbers could be offset?
We don't track that, but what I can say is for those districts that we've done their enrollment projections for the past 10 years, the percent of decline has gone down based on the new housing market. So I won't know next year if these enrollment projections are correct. And I don't know if you were doing enrollment projections before, but you may see that you won't lose, it won't decline by the, how many kids? We had projected that K-2, the 3-year would be 33. Maybe it would have been more without that increased housing stock. We can't know that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Karen? Well, thank you. Thank you, Karen. Thank you for spending time with us this evening and for actually going through this very detailed report. I'm sure if there's other questions that pop up after tonight, I'm sure we can kind of send them over to you.
Through the superintendent.
And through the superintendent, yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I'm sure there's, as we go through this and look at these reports, there might be other questions that pop up, and we welcome to be able to kind of pick your brain a little bit more by email through the superintendent.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you.
All right.
Thank you so much, Karen. And I really appreciate the clarity in your presentation, because it is very complicated and you made it very simple. So I appreciate that.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. So we'll have time after SLAM to actually talk about a few things, if in terms of where we go from here, or any other questions we might have for either one of our presenters. So the next one up is Mike Zuber from SLAM.
Yep, he's just entering now, so I'm about to let him in. There we go.
Hi, Mike.
Hi, everybody. How are you?
Hi, good, welcome. We have a special board meeting this evening to go through the enrollment projections. I know you have been doing this for Weston for a number of years now with Malone and McBroom, and now with SLAM. We have the board and the superintendent, Lisa, and the building principals here. And so why don't, you know the drill. You've been doing this for a while now, so we'll just leave it to you to get started.
I'm happy to do so. Let me start sharing my screen and we can get into it. And
Okay.
I hopefully everybody can start seeing it now.
Ah, great.
All right. You always got to check. Sometimes it doesn't work as planned. So then the last day in November. So here we are going through your enrollment projection. So where I always like to start is basically doing a comparison. And, you know, this is taking a look back 1 year, but I also took a look back the other day, several years of data just to take a look at the first set of projections that I had prepared for Weston back in the fall of 2017 and look at where they are relative today, even, you know, when the pandemic wasn't even a thing that anybody would have thought of at that time. And where we're at today with the projections from last year is we were off by about 50 so students, 54 to be exact. Our approach for projecting K is still working very well, and I'll touch on it in more detail, but that's where we rely on both the birth data to do a little bit of a traditional birth to K, and we blend that with regressing directly to kindergarten using a mathematical model. So those two get married together to produce K year over. And, you know, where I was a bit surprised in seeing some of the questions that Phil had forwarded over, and I'm seeing it across in other districts, is really looking at the high school, seeing the deviation we had there from what I had projected overall. And we'll touch on that a little bit later on. But overall, I thought considering the pandemic, they fared fairly well. Traditionally, where you know, it's harder to project is in that elementary grade grouping, that K2, that actually performed the best. And where it's traditionally a little bit easier to project in the high school, that had a little bit of greater disconnect, and that was at really each of the grade levels there except for 12th grade. So some new information that we didn't have last go around. The census is finally trickling out some data in dribs and drabs. So we were able to get the overall population for the town of Weston. It had slight growth there of just under 2%, now standing at 10,350 residents. This doesn't take into account the overall impacts of, say, all the moves that have happened nationally since the pandemic hit. As the fielding was going on slightly before and slightly into the start of the pandemic. And the census still has yet to be able to release cohort level demographic data. And what that means in the second bullet point is the way I've traditionally and historically have projected birth has been through doing a demographic analysis of female of childbearing age and, you know, projecting that forward based on the cohorts in town. So that data still has yet to be compiled and put out. It's lagging a little bit behind. So looking at the historic births, and for this year, we were able to get the births for January through October to be able to then extrapolate out for an estimate for 2021. But I think what really jumps out is that you have these periods of a little bit of fluctuation and you have these periods of stability. So 2015, 16, 17, you know, really going into 18, you were just below 60 or so, averaging in the mid 50s in births. And in the last several years, you've been up into the mid 60s. Our estimate for 2021 is estimating at 69. So that would be the same number as the reports for the DPH have for last year. So births have slightly uptick in town over the last 2 years. And just to touch back on that, these are births to resident mothers, and what isn't accounted for is if there's any out-of-state births yet in that 2020 number. So if there was a birth through a non-Connecticut hospital, it lags about 16 months or so for that to get into the state records there. So that's why I've marked that as preliminary for now. Looking at the unemployment rate, no surprise with the pandemic, we saw it spike up to locally almost 6.5%, has since dropped down based on the year to date. Weston's always trending below that of the county and the state as a whole. But I think the bigger picture with the employment is just what it's doing trend wise throughout all the communities, not only in Connecticut, but really throughout the nation, of just changing commuter patterns and what that looks like going forward. That's a big unknown for a lot of the planning and demographic work that I've been doing. We just don't know where it's going to settle long term with that. So looking at home sales, and this is through the Warren Group, which is an MLS service. We're able to purchase really by quarter home sales for every community. Last year ended at 277 total sales. What was the high point going back at least to late 1980s. This year we were able to get home sales through August, and we had 160 at year to date, and extrapolating out using the recent historic average, that puts us into 270s as well. So this current year is looking to end on par with last year at that elevated level as well. Taking a step and looking at the price points, I'll start on the right. I always like to be able to kind of look outside of the communities I'm working in, and I've pulled together a bunch of your neighbors and other communities throughout Fairfield County as well as the state. And I've tracked this chart for a number of years, looking at sort of that recovery of price points relative to the Great Recession collapse where we were beforehand, and shown in that blue bar. And what we're seeing across the board is that almost every community on this chart, and most communities I work with in the state of Connecticut, have all rebounded to pre-recession levels. Weston's year to date for median single family sales stands at about $973,000. Puts it on par with where you were back in 2005, 2006, in this bar chart on the left. So this is just a larger historic look back on sale price. Permitting, not much new activity. It's been really on par over the last several years. We were able to get year to date through September from the land use department. That stands at 8 permits. They're not seeing any new subdivision activity, so there's really no creation of new lots. What they are seeing is permitting on existing lots, but there's really no new subdivisions of new lots getting cut in town, which would later then have permitting activity. We'll say that they've recently drafted and adopted the new village regulations, which really just calls for mixed-use style development within the town center. Obviously, it's not going to be of a density of an urban form, but more of that smaller village scale, 3 stories. So something that typically would not generate a large number of school-age children, but something that could contribute to additional turnover of homes within the town of Weston, should those desire to stay in town and just don't want to have a single family home and want a different housing option. This is taking a look back at the historic enrollment, including 21, 22. I think what jumps out to me still is that same thing that I've talked about year over year, as we saw those large cohorts shown in this green color and the yellow color kind of move their way through the system. There's still several of them in the fainter green color that need to move on through the system. As that happens, and as they move on up through the middle school and high school and are replaced by these smaller orange colored cohorts, we're going to see that continued overall decline. But what we are seeing, especially at the elementary level, and it's something that we've been projecting for a couple of years now, is that the bottoming out of the elementary enrollment and this sort of leading edge of the elementary enrollment starting that rebound. We start to see it down here in the lower left. And this really kind of looks at sort of how you're stacked and how you're organized with school by school on campus, with Hurlbut being the light blue color, Wisp being the orangish red color, the middle school being the green color, and then the high school in the yellow. Same way of looking at the data, but what jumps out is that really good stability in the elementary school over the last several years, a good uptick over the last year. And then we're also seeing a little bit of stability there in the intermediate school, but we're still seeing a decline happening overall at the middle school and high school. Over the last several years, we've been pulling the data through the State Department of Ed and looking at the diversity overall. The most recent data point we have that's audited by the state is 2021. It gets released typically in the springtime. Based on the May report from 2021, you stand at 21% overall. minority composition. We're seeing growth overall really in the children that identify as 2 or more races, as well as those that are Hispanic or Latino, and those that are identified as Asian students. So increasing diversity overall for Weston student body. Here's your historic enrollment for the elementary school at Hurlbut. You can see this uptick here where we haven't reached the historic median, but trending towards that. But you can clearly see where the enrollment overall has bottomed out there. And then we're seeing a continued decline at WIS. Really, when I rolled up the sleeves and began looking at the grade by grade, this drop is a little bit more pronounced than we've seen in the past. And it's really looking at some grade cohorts there. Really, last year's 4th cohort was 176 students, and it gets replaced by a 4th grade cohort of 150 this year. So we've lost sort of that middle grade there at WIS. And that really led to this drop off in the enrollment just because of a lack of students in that grade cohort. Looking at the middle school enrollment, that dropped off from 558 to 541 students. Has had some fluctuations overall, as you can see. But over the last several years prior to the Great Recession, there was some stability there. Now what we're seeing, and that goes back to that earlier chart, is just really moving on of some of those larger grade cohorts or leaving the middle school, entering the high school, and getting replaced by some of those smaller grade cohorts that are currently in the intermediate school as well as the elementary school. And this is the effect of having those cohorts kind of swap out and replace each other. Those smaller 9th and 10th grade cohorts of 10 students each really kind of add up, as well as having a much smaller 11th grade cohort this year. So we've saw, as well as seeing some out migration, which I'll talk about in the persistency ratio slide ahead, has led to this more pronounced drop off in the high school enrollment over the last year. This is really just the primer of how we kind of go through and do the projection. So it does rely on the cohort survival, which looks at grades from year to year. So a ratio of 1 means that basically a cohort from, say, 1st to 2nd grade remains the same size. Whereas if it's 1.05, it grows 5%. Where we don't follow this is in areas where we might have large number of housing developments coming in, where we would override it. Then that's not the case in Weston. We don't rely on it solely for our birth projections. That's where we use that blended methodology. But what we do is we really look into what some of the enrollment drivers are and better understand how we're able to look at those ratios and what the background is to them before we include them, and basically select which of those are the most likely to impact enrollment going forward. So this is a good slide. I just want to pause here for a minute on. I think there's a couple really good data points here. I think one of them is that birth decay jump. Even though we don't solely rely on birth decay, it's a good proxy for where your kindergarten students are coming from. So it hit 2.3 this year. That's a high of recent years. Last time it was, of a similar scale was back in 16, 17, where it hit 2.6. So what that tells us is there's more students coming from outside of Weston in kindergarten than those that were, say, born in Weston 5 or 6 years earlier. And what I'm seeing overall in a lot of my client communities is this big birth decay this year, presumably due to delayed entrance. Say parents last year didn't feel comfortable sending their students, as well as some new arrivals to town. And we're seeing that increased ratio in both that birth decay as well as in K-1, which we're also seeing here with about a 10% jump over last year's number. So seeing additional first graders show up that weren't captured in the kindergarten the year prior. What we're seeing is some out-migration at the high school level, and that's where we had that disconnect because we do rely on that grade-to-grade persistency in cohorts to project the high school going forward. So where we would typically have an increase of students or even a flat number of students rolling from year to year, we've seen a drop-off there in the ratio for this year. So we've seen that in other communities where we've had this out-migration of students that typically would have been included in those high school cohorts. And I've also seen it where we've had an increase in high school students that typically would have been not factored into the cohort. But overall, you ended up with an overall net migration of about 2.5%. So what this tells me is that when I look at the student body of 2 through 7th in 2021 versus 3 through 8 as a whole, it grew 2.4%. During the first year of the pandemic, it grew 4.2%. What these numbers are, they're not outlandish, anomalous in any way, saying, you know, the pandemic kind of drove the number higher. In your recent history, you've had in-migration that was on that level, particularly in 2017, 18, 18, 19, where you were 4.25% to 4.5%, as well as 2.5% prior to that. I've seen some communities during the pandemic hit 5 or 6%. I've even had one hit 7%, where they were typically in the 2s in a given year. And that tells me that it's.
Mike, can I stop you there for a second? When you talk about migration estimate, right, what you're doing is you're normalizing then if you're removing the effect of cohort movement, right?
I'm looking at the sum of all 2nd to 7th graders in the prior year relative to 3rd through 8th graders in the current year.
Okay. Yeah, got it.
So there could be, and within that, there could be individual students that move in and out, but
Right.
I'm just looking at the collective totals of them.
Got it.
Yeah. So what that tells me is that even though we've had a very large number of housing sales the last 2 years, it's not driving your new student migration up. And when I look at the high school, what's happening there, that number hasn't increased over this past year. So I know it becomes this black box of sort of speculation on what's driving it. And there could be many, reasons for that of why we're not seeing that level of students. It's either families are moving in with students that aren't school age yet. Families are moving in, sending students to private schools or presumably staying in private schools that they're already in, or families are moving in without students with plans of having children going down the line. And unfortunately, there's no information out there to be able to get answers to those questions. It would make my life a lot easier, but it's just kind of reading into the numbers is what I'm seeing here relative to where others are in this second year of the pandemic.
Mike, can you stop there on the high school? Because that's really, I mean, when you look at your persistency ratio, it's a real, when you look at all of the numbers historically, it's an outlier, right? I mean, it's definitely an outlier. And what are you, because you're looking at many districts, what can you surmise from this with, when you look at other districts that are seeing the same thing, or maybe districts that are seeing that persistency ratio is closer to 1, we're seeing this data point and scratching our heads, and maybe we have some information about what families are doing, but what are you seeing?
I'm seeing everything but the kitchen sink. So I was pulling some information together this afternoon. So, for example, and I'm just opening up another file here that I have some notes in. In Ridgefield, we saw out-migration that was on par with this in 2020, followed by a strong rebound in 2021. And in Westport, I saw normal numbers in 2020, but a very similar set of out-migration for 21, 22 that you have here.
Mm-hmm.
And I have other communities that I'm working through that I haven't completed their projections yet. But I'm, others outside of Fairfield County, I'm seeing a lot of different factors. I'm seeing both that out-migration, and when I ask questions, and I'm sure you have some data points, what it really seems like to me, it's a collection, it's the cumulative effect of every families' individual decisions that are driving this.
Mhm.
So it could be someone getting, making a job change or relocation. I'm going to go to private school because the parents are going to somewhere else outside of Weston. There's a lot of things that are going into that. And I think the only way to be able to kind of factor what's happening locally is to get an understanding upon entrance and exit, what are some of the reasonings behind it? Almost like a little bit of a.
Do you think it could be the flip side of what we're seeing in the lower grades, meaning that because the median housing prices are going up and there's a demand for housing, people aren't necessarily waiting for their kids to graduate before they sell their house. They're getting a good price now and saying, well,
Yeah,
it's probably a good time to sell.
in my 20 plus years of doing this, and that's been through sort of the housing boom, the bust, the in between, and now a pandemic, I've never experienced where parents are apt to leave if they have a choice to not leave when a child is in high school.
Right.
Regardless of, where they, and I understand it's an individual financial decision, and there's other parameters to that, but just to make a generalized statement, Anthony, I've never seen that happen.
Right. Okay.
But it honestly jumped out at me, especially when I go through and I do that review and I take pride in being able to get as close as I can to those numbers. And I look back at all my different models and I said everything was telling me there would be a certain number of high schoolers here, even going back to 2017, 18, 19, 20. And it was just these factors were just anomalies, and no one will know unless you understand the drivers or you see what happens next year.
Right. How many standard, just to be a little technical here for a second, how many standard deviations is this from the mean, do you think?
Oh, I don't have it offhand on that one. But I mean, you could look at it and typically what we'll see is, a sway of say 1.5% per year.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, we're seeing on some of these, especially like look at the 7 through 8, that's 6, 6,
Mm-hmm.
6.
Yeah.
It's well above what we would mark against.
Yeah. Okay.
Well above. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question as well before we move from that slide?
Sure. Let me go back.
Sorry, Mike.
Sorry. Yep.
The birth decay, you have the number there is obviously increasing on a overall scale. I don't know if you have statewide, national statistics, whatever. Are we seeing post-COVID any sort of a baby boom of sorts taking place right now?
Yeah, I've been actively collecting everybody's 2021 birth data and comparing them to what I was estimating. And every single community, whether you're urban, suburban, or even a couple of the rural ones I work in, they've had a birth uptick.
Okay.
And what I'm trying to figure out is, okay, we've all lived through COVID. We've all lived through the lockdown. That has some boredom in it, but also the truth of the matter is, when you look demographically at our nation, the millennial generation is the largest group now. They've surpassed the baby boomers. And as they enter that family starting years and child rearing years, there's so many of them, it's no surprise that births, every research institute is looking at births upticking. The contributing factors to the low births were the Gen Xers, just because, my generation, there wasn't many. I mean, they were the smallest. So it's no surprise that births were down because those that are contributing to the birth population is low. So looking at the millennials and saying that a bunch of them, even though, historically, you look at the delay versus what happened during the baby boomers when people were having kids and Gen Xers, there's a bit of a delay there. The births are likely going to uptick nationwide just because of the sheer numbers and what happens locally. So it didn't surprise me. So I think there was the two factors there. So you'll see when I did the birth projections, I was a little bit conservative on it. I didn't want to go too heavy-handed until some better data comes out. And I think when the census puts out that cohort level data, we'll be able to look at, so the total population now exists for Weston in the 2020 census. What they will provide us as soon as it gets released is male and female and 5-year age cohorts.
Right.
So that actually then gives us something that we can work with. So not to get too geeky, but that'll be exciting to actually put some data behind the numbers.
But how confident are you in the census figures, considering it took place in the midst of a pandemic and there's been a lot of migration during that time period?
I'm more confident than me just making up numbers or anybody else just making up numbers. So
fair enough. All right. Sorry, I don't want to take you too far off track, but I just want to
I don't think they're going to go back out and refield anything, but I do think that when they put out the 1 year and 2 year estimates, they're going to field it much more heavily than they did in the past. So I think that'll help with it. So I just wanted to explain a little better, kind of, you know, in my mind, how I go through this without getting too much into the information on it. So for our high projections, we're looking at being able to take an average of 69 births over the next few years, for which I don't have births for, simply put. That's, you know, that's taking into account the last 2 years that have been about 69. So really no uptick in the births. The medium is looking at, you know, slightly below that at 66, and then the low projections are 61. So nothing that you haven't experienced in the last 10 years historically, but based on the information that comes out, I wouldn't be surprised if that number is higher than 70 next year. But I just didn't have the information to feel confident to do that. And then when I ran all the models and all the background information, I just simply went back and I looked at what that student migration looks like in order to say, where do these benchmark in your recent historic past? So when I ran the high model, that benchmark is at a 3.5% immigration. So I had this year at about 2.5, but we had a couple 4s in there. So when you look at that 3.5%, that kind of represents the average of the last 5 years. So if you were to average that out, that's 3.5% per year. The median projections, that modeled out at 3% immigration. So 3% net new students there. That was exactly your last 10-year average. So if you average out the last 10 years, my median model basically takes that in-grade student groupings and models that going forward at that same percentage. Now, granted, there's little factors that happen every year where you'll have a higher one and a lower one, but that's what it averages out for. And then the low projection averages out at 2% immigration. When this occurred last was between 2008 and 2015, so right after the Great Recession. So when everything kind of slowed down, you saw that loss of students. That's kind of what that number represents going forward, just to put it in, you know, a little bit of kind of Weston-esque context.
Right. But when you look at the average in migrations, it's front loaded, right? Meaning it's higher for the lower grades than it is for the upper grades, right?
It is not.
It's not. Okay, so you use you use the same one for all grades?
No, each grade has its own persistency ratio and its own model.
But on average, okay, I got it.
This takes the average of all of them and looks at what that entire growth would be from year to year.
Okay, all right, I got it.
Without getting into kind of the weeds.
Yep, got it.
But each grade kind of models differently. So like, yeah. So like where we historically have some losses and some gain, well, you mostly have gains, but where, you know, we look at sort of this history, it's the cumulative impact of all of this.
Yeah, got it.
All right, and then looking at our birth decay, so going back like probably 8 years now, and I believe it may have been Ridgefield was the first community I started breaking away from that traditional birth decay, that static birth decay, just sort of tracking those that have, you know, kindergartners that were born in town versus those that have migrated into town since they've been born. This year, the percentages have about 54 of those kindergartners were born here, 72 were from migration. Going back to that year 2016-17, which I had a birth decay of, I think, 2.6 or so, we had 79 migrated in versus 49 were born here. But traditionally, over the recent history, it's been skewed towards the green part of the stack bar, those that have been not born within the community, versus going back a number of years, it was relying on the birth. So that just adds more reasoning behind what we're seeing, at least currently in the models of how kindergartners are arriving within many of our communities in the state of Connecticut. Should we have a massive number of births, say 4 or 5 years down the line, we may shift more towards this type of a stacked bar relationship. I don't know if we'll ever get back to this kind. That was a large number of births there, and people just were of the mindset of when they moved to a community, they laid down the roots and sort of had children in that home that they purchased versus moving with children in tow. So I think there's a lot at play there.
Just out of curiosity, was the demographics of Weston, was it an aging community? Is that why we saw that? Was the average age increasing with the lower birth rates?
Well, now Weston is aging. Back then, you were just kind of starting to age a little bit, but also nationally is when we had a lot of birth peaks were occurring back in this time frame.
Right.
As well as, and it honestly aligned perfectly with birth rates were at a high, not 1960s baby boom high. It was kind of referred to as like the mini baby boom, a little bit, but also we had a large number of home sales. The economy was cranked. There was a lot of things that contributed to those factors that went into that back then.
Right. All right. Not to geek out too much with you, but I'm really curious to see what this transition as far as the home sales are concerned is going to show moving forward as far as our birth rates are concerned. Because I think there have been a lot more younger families coming in. I think like you mentioned earlier, a lot of people held off selling their homes until home prices could rebound a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think that's happened now, so let's wait and see.
All right, so this just goes back through that methodology just for the kindergarten. So, we do use the birth decay a little bit. It contributes to the model, but we also, don't use a static birth decay. So what I do is I establish a relationship where I have this sort of birth decay equation where I use a variable birth decay. And then I take this other approach where I regress historic births, home sales, and historic CAD data directly to kindergartners. And those get blended together to yield each of the kindergarten classes. And I will say that over the last several years, it's been really kind of working well in the communities that I use that methodology for. So if we were just to rely on solely the birth decay, when something jumps up to a 2.6 birth decay, we're not going to pick up on that and get ahead of the curve and be able to be within a handful of students on kindergarten, because would be like, I don't even know how to, it would be pure luck if you were able to do it that way. There wouldn't be any math or science behind it. So this is just the regression. Our R squared did take a slight dip with this year's data, but still at 0.93. And I'm not going to throw something that works out just because the R squared value fell, a few hundredths of a point. But overall, it's working. Here was the assumptions that went into it. And it is driven by home sales. It's very slightly driven by the median sale price. I believe that contributes less than 1% of the model, but it has been included in there historically. So what the low model does, and even though we're showing an average of 200, it actually drops the annual home sales in that last year of the 10 years down to about 150. The median model averages 220 per year, but drops it down to the number of home sales that you've experienced in 2017-18. And the high model averages 230. So nowhere near that 270 that you're at now, but it does drop it back down to 200 sales. So elevated above where you were pre-recession, but nowhere near where you were marking you at over the last 2 years. So I feel both of these are, rather conservative in that ultimately the price is going to dictate the number of sales as well as other factors of supply and demand of the market. And selling 270 homes in a community of this size year over year over year over year over year is likely not going to happen for 10 years. You're going to get to that point, and that's kind of how we model it forward. But they do have a bearing on it, but I still believe that that medium model works really, really well. And that high model, which is showing the blue line on top here, shooting it up to just under 2,600 students, is something that's not likely going to happen unless we have that perfect storm of, say, immigration continues at that historic level, housing sales continue at that historic level over that course of the next decade. The green line shows that median model, which really reflects your last 10 years and has some reasonable assumptions built into it. That seems to be the most likely trajectory. I think the low model is very pessimistic. I can't see your immigration, especially now during the current housing and economic climate, to drop to that 2% level of where you were at immediately following the Great Recession. I know we've had some shakeups, but I think the Great Recession was much different than what we're seeing now with the pandemic of what the drivers are behind it and where we're at actually demographically, not only as a community, but a state and a nation. So I'll get into some of the more details now, but these are really the three models. They were adjusted slightly upwards from last year's model, and some of that's the increased housing sales, and some of that is the birth increase that we saw again this year. So it's looking at those two successive years of nearly 70 births, made some slight changes there. But also I've looked at the high school data and I've muted that to say that this past year, until we know more, shouldn't weigh heavily on the model of this level of outmigration going forward at the high school level. So it's been included, but it's been muted because I just think it's, knowing Weston, it's a bit of an anomaly there. I won't spend any time on all of the details. This is just the grade by year overall for the next 10 years. What Hurlbut looks like going forward. We're projecting very similar enrollment actually for the next couple of years that we've had this year. So no major changes. Then we see a little bit of an uptick as those births have a little bit of a lag to start entering the system. So, where we see almost 70 births 2 years in a row, they really don't pan out until getting into the school system, about midpoint in our projections, but an increase and then a flattening at about 490 students going forward. We're seeing a dip over the next year at the intermediate school, and then we start to see some cohorts begin to move through. And this is really a good example of, as we sort of move on some of those smaller cohorts and we start to get some of these little bit larger cohorts kind of move in, we start to see this rise in enrollment and eventually levels off and rises again. You can notice kind of like there's 3 grades in the school, and you start to see these little groupings here of 3 grades of enrollment cohorts sort of as they build and then flatten out over time. So really ending up at about 560 or so students in the back half of the projections. We have a little bit more variability at the middle school projected enrollment. We're going to drop down at about the 4-year mark to just over 500 students, and then begin to climb up and then flatten off and then climb up again, where we end up at just between 575 and 590 for those last 2 years. And then with the high school, we have some stability, averaging just over 700 and the 720s for several years. And then some smaller grade cohorts leave the middle school, enter the high school, and drop the enrollment back down into the 680s. And then we start to see that rebound again, getting up over 700 students, but not back to your present day level in the next 10 years. So the enrollment there is still going to be lower than where it is today. And this is just a recap of my talking points, but I'll leave that up because I know you probably have plenty of questions then that you want to go through and discuss.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Do you
Yep.
want to maybe go to the full screen so you can all see each other?
Sure. Let me just stop the share here.
Maybe I can start. A couple of things. One is the story here. If you look at what's underpinning, the flattening and the increase in your median projection, the story is K-5, right? Is the fact that it seems like that is the thing that's going to, as the smaller cohorts work through the system, though it seems like K-5, the combination of in-migration and births are really, that's the thing that's basically stabilizing and then turning the corner in terms of our projections. And so we have to really, and ultimately, in 5-6 years, we're going from a K-5 of, almost 900 students to over, basically piercing 1,000 students, which is a big move, right? So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because it sounds, am I right in thinking that it's the combination of the number you're using as the birth rates and the in-migration that's really causing that? Because and it's assuming that housing prices are housing sales are going to basically be somewhat elevated, not necessarily where we've seen in the last 2 years, but still at a somewhat elevated level, right?
Yeah, they're all showing just to touch on the housing sales number, they're not going to continue at 270 sales annually.
Right.
They're all going to start to drop back off, but just at different rates.
Right.
And that's really only driving the kindergarten. So everything within students that are in the system are kind of getting driven through those persistency ratios. So the big thing is you grow, even though you're losing students at the high school now, you really grow students from year to year. So you grow cohorts once the kids get here. Some years you grow cohorts 10, 11, 12, 14 students. And that's happening at all the elementary grades. So now that you have a larger starting point for those are going to continue to grow. And you're right, it's the leading edge. The elementary is that leading edge.
Right.
And, the enrollment kind of balances both sides of the scale. Once you graduate out all those larger cohorts, that's then kind of, they're getting replaced by smaller. So you're declining on the far end at the high school, but you're growing at the elementary. And you're right. And eventually you'll get to the point where you're having static size cohorts kind of flowing in through the high school. And that's when you start that uptick overall, is when that stabilizes. Yeah. When the ninth grade cohort's the same size as the 12th grade cohort, now you're going to start to see enrollment growth again. And the only concern that I had was just, whether or not the outmigration at the high school is something that's going to be a new trend, or it's something that just happened once. And right now I'm modeling it as something that happened once, because when I went back, that's never happened before here. And we're also seeing it in other communities. So I think, there'll be other data points out there to better understand sort of, what is happening here.
One kind of big picture question. You've been doing this for a while around Fairfield County. There have been districts, we've basically seen, in the last 10 years, about a 10% decrease in our enrollment. There are districts who have seen worse. There are districts who have been a lot better, more stable. Can you talk a little bit about the characteristics of the town and the districts on either end of the spectrum? Is there anything you can glean from the fact that some districts have seen maybe even a 15 to 20% decline, and some districts have seen a couple of percent growth in the last 10 years? Is there, can you differentiate them? Is there a difference in the towns, their locations, their, characteristics that that kind of lead you to understand a little bit more about why that happened?
That's a tough question. I thought I knew the answer up until the pandemic.
Yeah.
But truly, it's kind of like, it's funny because you all get grouped together down in Lower Fairfield County as being similar, but I see something different in each community, right?
Right.
So while everybody was declining across the board, you know, from say 2009 until 2016, I had a client in Darien where their enrollment was growing and they just didn't start declining until a few years ago. So
Right.
theirs was lagged like 8 years, and it was just, what is the reasoning behind that? And I can't put a finger on exact answers of why it's happening the way it's happening, which makes it a little bit trickier to kind of at least anecdotally explain to myself what's some of the drivers. It really is, I think I said it before, where it's just this culmination of all these different factors kind of contribute to where you're at, but it's so hard to break each one apart and figure out like what percent, you know, each one is as a driver for it. I don't think you can do it.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Other board members, administration, questions for Mike?
Sure. Mike, I have a question. The model that you showed us where it focuses a little bit on, or it includes, I should say, the number and price of home sales. I'm wondering how much you've dug into, or whether you're able to dig into, you know, who's doing the selling and who's doing the buying, and the related impact on enrollment. I just remember from years past in your presentation to us that, you know, one of the challenges we faced in terms of our declining enrollment was that we had older residents in town who felt that they weren't in a position where they could, or where they wanted to, sell their home because it would have resulted in a loss. So now that we've seen these home prices rebound, you know, do we have any sense as to whether they've sold their homes or whether they're continuing to hold on to them in hope of further profit? Similarly, with respect to the people that are buying, do we have an understanding as to, are these, you know, what percentage are second home buyers? I mean, here in Weston, I think there are people that are buying into this market. I've certainly met them around town who are here either just for the summer or here temporarily with the intent of moving back to Manhattan, or have put their kids even in school here temporarily with the intent of putting them back in Manhattan. You know, do we have a sense as to what degree that's happening here, and whether it's a short-term issue or a long-term issue, and whether it's unique to Weston or Fairfield County or the state of Connecticut? You know, these are the types of things we're thinking about as we're trying to really understand our projections and the impact on our facilities.
Yeah, I don't have any data that would come from, say, that's something that could actually like, that was something that was real information that said, you know, X number of, you know, individuals over 65 sold homes, or, you know, families with this type of composition moved in. You know, I ask those questions all the time when I do realtor interviews, and then unfortunately that level of information gets protected. But I think one of the ways to be able to get into that would be to conduct a survey of new residents. I do know the town has a strong survey committee. That would be a great way to be able to get some of those answers. I will say, from looking at the data, I was surprised that I didn't see many more new students based on 2 successive years of increased home sales. So I think, to your point of some of these being second homes, or maybe not sending students into the school system, that's definitely, you know, happening. But to what level, I don't know, because in other communities where I'm seeing that elevated home sales, I'm seeing, you know, estimates of migration that were once 2.5%, 3%, are now 7-8% for 2 years in a row. And we're clearly seeing a lot of new students arriving, and we're not seeing it here. But that's not to say that those that are buying into the market may have children that are between 0 and 5 that aren't yet showing up yet. So the only way to get that is to almost have like a localized kind of like census or survey.
Right. No, fair enough. And, you know, what about your thoughts just generally on, you know, if we step it back a little bit and go a little bit more broadly, you know, what about, suburban living versus urban living and trends that you're seeing. I mean, pre-COVID, we had certainly, heard from your firm that perhaps, this was a trend that may not be favorable for Weston's geography and what our town has to offer in terms of what younger families are looking for. But now COVID, I think, has kind of highlighted some of Weston's assets and what may be drawing younger families here. How much of your model or your thoughts are related to that in a COVID bubble versus a longer term trend? Do you think that COVID has caused people to seek out a town like Weston more so than previously, or is that just because is it just a COVID related phenomenon that will dissipate once the virus dissipates?
Good question. I think it spotlighted a lot of Connecticut, to be honest with you. Communities, Weston, others that are renowned for their schools and, the lifestyle. I think it brought that to light for a lot of the millennial generation that's looking to kind of settle down. I mean, where do you want to have your family, your children in a school system? A lot of those same values that, have traditionally led to the settlement of Weston and other communities. I think that kind of was brought into the spotlight during the pandemic. I do think that likely it will, maybe they would not have found it as quickly should the pandemic have not happened. But I'm a firm believer in that a lot of the family choice of, do I want to raise my child in an urban environment or a suburban environment? What is, better off there? That happened a little bit quicker due to the pandemic. And I also think that, to my earlier point, there's just more people out there that are starting families and will be starting families in the next, say, 2 to 5 years, due to just the size of the next generation, that they're going to be looking to make those type of choices. And, now, Connecticut, for positive got highlighted for years. We've been, Weston, many communities have been sort of, branded with that. Well, everybody's leaving, people are fleeing because they can't afford this and don't want to live here. Well, that exact opposite happened over the last 2 years. And, it's going to be a testament of the communities here, like Weston, when they stay, to say, this is something that they value. I think it's something that we're going to have to watch, but I think a lot of what people value, especially as they get into, starting families, Weston has a lot of things that are, important when you look at picking a place to live.
I'm going to piggyback on top of that too, Melissa, and say that I work with the Weston Women's League in town. And one of the things I've noticed is that we have had a lot of younger women who have been coming to join the organization, and a lot of them have toddlers. So they're not going to count into the birth rate. They're not going to show up in schools yet, but they definitely have moved to town. And I think primarily because, imagine going through a lockdown in an apartment with a toddler or two, and they fled. So that's something that I've seen, just, from putting my ear to the ground, but who knows?
Hey, Mike, I have a couple of questions. I saw, I think it was 2 separate slides, and I tried to get the slide number, but admittedly I was busy typing notes and didn't take the slide number down.
All right.
You make mention on one of the slides, let's see here, that the births for 2021 births mirrored births from 2015 to 2017. And I think you said about 55. Does that slide ring a bell? Or that number? That
20, yeah, slide 23.
23. Okay. Yeah, I was trying to pull up on my screen at the same time, but I was.
Oh yeah. So on slide, if I could share again, I could pop it right up, David.
Yeah.
So we could speak directly to it.
Yeah. Okay. So my question on this slide is that, so a little bit of piggybacking on what Sharon was saying, that, I guess anecdotally she's going to events where she sees women with toddlers. who have, potentially fled the city, fled, 1,500 square foot apartment for a house with 2 acres. We don't know if they're sticking around. They could be heading back to Brooklyn, as soon as, things become more accessible and the lockdowns are lifted. So if you kind of put what Sharon is seeing just to the side for a moment, and you were to look at the births mirroring from 3 years ago, doesn't that mean that we should expect continued low enrollment, lower, more on par with your low estimates rather than your moderate or medium?
No, not really. My low estimate looks at, and that wouldn't be the slide. My low estimate looks at the number of students that, and I'll pop up the correct slide here. So my low estimate looks at migration levels that happened right after the Great Recession. So here, where you had either very low new immigration into the community, very little housing turnover because of the Great Recession and the flipping of the housing market, essentially. That's what that really looks at happening again, versus say the last few years where we've had strong positive growth, anywhere between 3 and 3.5%. So that low estimate kind of models off of this, and from a birth standpoint, that low estimate looks at having future births that are, let me find my birth slide here. My low estimate has having future births that are slightly above, this number, but not as high as this number. So the spread is very low. My high estimate looks at the 69 births that you've experienced over the last 2 years continuing. My medium estimate looks at having, I believe I said 66 births continuing over average of the next 5 years. And then my low estimate looked at 61 births. So, somewhere right around this banding in here is where my low estimate was.
Okay. So my other question or clarification, and again, I didn't get the slide number.
Yep.
You mentioned, let me take a look at my note here. That I believe you were referring to our current K-4 enrollment is the lowest historical enrollment. I think it was a slide a little bit after 23, but you make mention, I guess I'm looking for clarification. I quickly jotted down K4, what I wrote was K4.
It was, yeah, slide 29.
Okay,
Slide 29,
thanks, Tony.
probably there, right?
I think right around there. Well, here's the basis of my question. I guess the first question is, maybe we have to find the slide. Is that correct that currently our K4 enrollment is the lowest historical enrollment?
No, actually your current, and I'll go back to the historic enrollment. I think it's easier for me to see on that one actually. So your current K2 enrollment at 456 pre-K2 is the highest it's been since 2014, and your middle school and your intermediate school enrollment is at the low. That may be the one where it was your 3 to 5 enrollment is actually at the lowest it's been. Okay,
yeah. So yeah, I probably just mistyped it. So I think my question. So if we look at this, the 3 to 5 enrollment, and as they matriculate through the system, unless we see a large in-migration, wouldn't we say that we can expect over the next potentially 7 years that we're going to see low enrollment as these 3rd to 5th graders move up through the system?
Well, there's one really low grade in that grouping, and that will bring down enrollment as it kind of moves through. So if you think of it's kind of the inverse of a bubble where you have one big grade and it creates this bulge of students. it's kind of the inverse of that, what's happening. I think this slide probably helps me answer your question a little bit better. So here's kind of your current enrollment in grades 3 through 5 right here. So what we end up seeing is where we have a 5th grade class of say 179 students, and then we have a 3rd grade class of 140 students. Even though there's growth that occurs to those cohorts from year to year, when this 179 leaves and moves into 6th grade, that turns into 185. So what happens then at the 3 through 5 grouping is, you know, you have some growth. So 140 turns to 148, 150 turns to 153. But that 140 gets replaced with 163. So the growth from 2nd to 3rd. So even though you've lost a big cohort, and you know, we've lost a big cohort before this from last year to this year. So that's kind of impacting that enrollment, but they quickly kind of move on through and they get replaced with another grade grouping or another grade cohort. So as we sort of track that ebb and flow, we're having this constant replacement of new students in the system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see. Yeah. And then what my last question is, was there a slide for comparison purposes for, I did see your one of your older reports. So do we have anything to compare, for example, your findings from the past 10 years or 5 years to today? Because basically this is all of the projections, right? Based on in-migrations. Is there any way to historically look back at your past projections to see the level of accuracy for for actual versus projection? And could we apply that somewhat the next 10 years?
Yeah, I kept it pretty simple when I pulled it together. Let me just kind of do a copy and paste here, and then I can pull it over to this screen and hopefully it shows up. You guys, oops, there's redundancy on that one. Hang on. All right. So do you see that a new Word document up there in front of you?
Yeah.
All right, good. Sometimes it makes me unshare and then share. I don't ever understand the logic behind it. So, all right. I looked at my past projections. This went back to 2017. That's the first year I had prepared projections back when you were doing, I believe, a master plan back then, or facility condition assessment. So your K-12 actual for this year, 2196. Back in 2017, I projected for this year, 2175. So just, what is that? Simple math is 21 students off. And then each year we make some adjustments based on new data. So 2018, we were at 2237. So the difference of 41 students. 2019, we were at 2214, difference of 18 students. And then my projections during the pandemic, oddly enough, my most recent one, when we had a lot of speculation on what was going on with the enrollment, was 54 students high, as I discussed earlier, but really due to some of the drivers at the high school of what we're seeing there. So overall, the trajectory hasn't changed much at all for my projections for your system. And in fact, going back to 17, which that was based off of 2016 data, because we prepared it before October 1st. So really 5 years out, it was within, a handful of students or a singleton or two per grade.
Okay. Thank you.
So in spite of everything that happened with the pandemic, all the craziness, that model back then still performed very well now. So, what that told me, when I go back and I review these things, is that we're not seeing the tremendous, even though different things are happening at the grade level for the system as a whole, what I projected back then isn't that far off of what actually happened today.
Yeah, that was kind of the basis of my question. Look at, I don't want to say your accuracy, but I didn't have these numbers handy, I was kind of looking to see. do I bring you to Vegas?
I don't know. Based on that, I probably should. We should do a road trip. But it's funny. So I look at how much time and effort I put into kind of like mulling over and spinning on these numbers, and something I produced, back in the fall or it's actually August, September of 2017. Pretty much held water, in spite of a pandemic.
Right.
I can't say that for, and to make me want to go do that exercise when I have time. But I can't say that for many of my other communities. The pandemic really kind of flipped 180 on what was going on in many of them enrollment wise that I didn't foresee.
And you mentioned just one quick thing too. You mentioned that if we did a town survey, I think you kind of said that after Sharon, shared her knowledge. Would that be something that is uncommon or common, where a town like Weston, which on one of your slides you said is very hard to predict Weston, and there's very little births happening in Weston. People tend to bring their children into town. Would you recommend that we survey the town at this point to get a better idea or to supplement the information that you have?
Based on projections I did 4 years ago without that data that are within a handful of students, I would say no would be the answer to that. But overall, if you want to understand what's behind it and what some of the drivers are going forward, I would say that if you had the resources to do it and people were willing to participate, it doesn't hurt. But I'm always of the mindset of leaning to, firsthand information that you can either get through, students when they first register, students when they exit. If the same can be said through, I know the town-wide committee, which, at my prior firm, I worked on the 10-year master plan for the town, and they did a tremendous job of, fielding a town-wide survey for that gave us great information. If it could be piggybacked as part of something else and you can get some key questions on there, I'd say why not? I do know there's a time and an expense to it. But if, there's an opportunity to do it and you can get some pointed questions on it, take the opportunity to get them answered. They'll explain, what some of the things that we're just kind of modeling and using our, sort of our demographic sense and knowledge to kind of project forward.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I was wondering if we could circle back a little bit to the reliability question. And my concern is, so we look at the birth decay model. It looks like 93% of the variance was explained by the births and the house sales and getting that number, which is a terrific number. But in the past couple of years, we've had so many house sales during COVID and we don't know the population that's consistent with the kinds of families that have moved in the past. That's going to have a huge effect on the model going forward. I mean, it kind of assumes that the same families are the same exact families that have been moving on, so that the 93% will still be 93%. But we don't have any kind of background information to show that those families are going to be consistent to that model that we're relying on. So doesn't that enter a lot more variability into the 10-year plan as we go forward compared to maybe past years?
So good question. So I basically take that model that's at 93% and I average that with the traditional with like a birth decay model. And that 93% got updated this year with the housing sales that get lagged 1 year. So when I projected K enrollment this year, which I was within one, I had used last year's housing sales. So I had updated that. I update that model every year based on all the latest information. So my R squared value went from 98% down to 93%. So it showed that 277 or that 272 and 277 did have a greater deviation from what we were modeling earlier. However, when the combined model got put together between the regression and the cohort, it still yielded a result within one, although my confidence interval or my R squared value on that one component was slightly lower. And every year I go through and I update that formula. So each year I'm constantly updating that formula and I'm looking at outliers on whether or not I need to drop off outliers based on what I'm seeing. And in 5 years from now, it may be determined that the pandemic is causing me to drop off those 2 COVID years for your future model. Like, and the model will get adjusted slightly. But that model was first run back in 2017. And, K is a huge part of that. And, we were within, 19 or, 21 students, number of years later, and a lot of stuff has happened since 2017. Back then, if I came here and told you in 2017 that you were going to have 270 home sales and prices were going to reach $1 million, and in 4 years from now, I think you guys would have kicked me out of the meeting, like that I was crazy. But it doesn't need to factor in that level, because what it does is it models the relationship
Right.
between all those variables. So I don't have to know exactly what it's going to be, just that there is that relationship there. And the way it's kind of, for lack of a better term, normalized with the traditional birth decay, it kind of balances out really well, where it's not leaning so heavily on just that real estate component to it. And that's only for the K component. All the rest of it is more of a traditional model.
Okay,
Oh.
so so we're saying countering last year's housing sales, we saw the model move from 98% to 93%. But if we're thinking out and planning in a 10-year time frame, as the rest of the anomalies with the big house sales play out, the kids who are not born yet or probably before school age, not looking at this year's kindergarten year, we're projecting out to kindergarten 4 or 5 years from now. How concerned are you that the model will be off from this being so many home sales and that being such a big factor into how we can identify that K number?
Yeah, good question. So let me share again. Sorry, we'll lose everybody's pictures up here. All right. So this is one small component. So this overall, this regression accounts for less than 50% of your K every year, right? So I've changed these variables, which feed into that one component of that model. So when I look at the back of my deck here and I'm comparing, and I'm just going to slide my own slides around here. Hopefully I remember to put them back. All right, so under our low model, which, we're saying our future births, and I know I said I had an average there, but really our future births that I don't know. We go from 69, we're going to drop down to 61, 61, 62, 63, right? We're yielding kindergarten enrollments that range in the future here, especially for those unknown years. I'll call it the last 5 years, sort of. That's the biggest question mark. We're looking at, say, high 120s. And my medium model, which is looking at births of, say, 66, is slightly below where you're at today, but is yielding 137 births. So that's the difference of, or kindergartners, that's the difference of 10 kindergartners between those two models. That's just kindergartners. There's no other changes that are relying on that housing data. The rest of all of this is just relying on different levels of immigration, absent of that formula, silent to that formula. And then the high model, which is projecting births high 60s to, just into the low 70s, which is not, really 1 or 2 more than where you're at today, is projecting 140s. So there's a spread of about 10 kindergartners. We're not, and this is all on the slide, we're not projecting the difference of 30 or 40 kindergartners between the models. So any concern with what we don't know in the future on the housing or the composition of the housing does not have a tremendous bearing on what's driving the entirety of Weston's enrollment. Hopefully that kind of demystifies some of the mystique of the demography.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions for Mike? All right, Mike, thank you. Thanks a lot for the presentation, for all the work, and for spending time with us to explain all of this. I feel like I've gone through a very interesting math statistics class this evening.
Well, nobody
you,
in my
Mike.
household here cares to hear me talk about it, so I'm glad everyone here does. And it was good seeing all your faces again, and I wish everybody well as we head into the new year soon.
All right.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. And
All
we'll
right.
follow
Thank you.
up with we'll follow up through the superintendent if we have any other questions for you.
All right. Have a good evening.
All right. Thanks again, Mike.
Take care.
So here we are. We have 2 enrollment projections now. So the obvious question is, how do they compare? And I think I'll be, I'm going to talk to Lisa tomorrow about, comparing the 2. But the biggest, we use these enrollment projections for 2 reasons, right? And one is at budget time for anticipated staffing levels for the lower grades. And secondly, this year, because we have the facilities work going on, a lot of the longer term projections will inform us as to what the long-term facilities needs might be. And it's interesting because the biggest difference between the Nasdaq projections and SLAM are in the lower grades, K to 5, which is the sweet spot of what we actually need to really have a view on, which is staffing levels next year and long-term projections. And that's where they really differ. And so, my view is the next step is really, and maybe at the next board meeting or probably wait until we kind of get some of the budget stuff together, but we're going to need to discuss the differences and maybe have a discussion and a point of view on, because we're going to need to use these. And I think we're going to need to discuss how we do this, whether we use one, the other, or average them, or, I think, but if you could spend a little time with them, that's the next discussion we're going to need to have. It's not for this evening, but we're going to need to put both together in a way that's easy to understand the differences, where the differences lie, and potentially have a view. And I'm glad we did 2 this year, actually. But I think we're going to need to have a view on how we use the 2. And I don't think we know enough to say one is better than the other or use one as opposed to the other. But I think we're going to need to figure out how we use both to our advantage. But anything else we should discuss before we close up tonight? Any other thoughts? Any things we should be thinking about and doing in the meantime?
Yeah, Tony, I think something that came up a couple times in both presentations, I think we have to understand, it's not just the numbers, but what's behind the numbers. And, the idea of surveying residents or talking to real estate agents or understanding a little bit more about who the buyers and sellers in town are and what the ramifications are short and long term is something we may want to consider. We may not have. Yeah.
I don't know, but I always thought that, I actually surveying new home buyers is one thing, but something as simple as making sure the real estate agents have some sort of form that buyers fill out a short survey when they, before they close, that we could actually include in a townwide database or something like that. But I'll have a conversation with their first select woman and maybe if we can figure out ways.
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering
Maybe if it's positioned as a census, you know what I mean? A townwide census where we're really trying to collect data so that we can structure our and your, taxes
Or
and
just-
facilities associated.
or if there's any surveys going out as part of the, FOC committee, if there's any that are going out anyway, if we could piggyback on a question or 2.
I think, it shouldn't be. I mean, it doesn't sound like it's something that should be all that difficult to do.
Or nor does it seem like it is a prying type of survey, right? I mean, I guess in some way we're asking how many small children do you have and what ages are they? We're not saying, do you plan on getting pregnant and having babies? We're obviously not going to be asking that. But it's not, it's really a census-based survey.
Tony, I have two questions.
Yeah.
The first is, one of my big pushes has been to have be more proactive and transparent with communication. Are we going to have a meeting that involves the general public so that, obviously they've had an opportunity to look at the numbers if they choose to, but they haven't had an opportunity to talk to us and share things with us that we might not be thinking of. So is there going to be an opportunity for the public to weigh in on these things?
I think that the opportunity for the public is usually the implications of these things on, the next place where this really kind of the rubber meets the road here is budget time. And that's where I think the opportunity is for people to weigh in. I think people weighing in on the number, I'm not sure. I think people, when they look at the implications of the number, then I think we'll have a view, right? I think the numbers themselves, it's out there. I mean, that's the reason we have this meeting in public. The data's out there. We have an opportunity at budget time to have a Q&A with the public. There'll also be an opportunity when we look at potential configurations of in the facilities work to have these community engagement meetings where this will obviously come up, which this will be a big factor in whatever configurations are viable in terms of long-term view on the configuration of the campus. So, I guess, are you thinking just having some public input on the numbers?
No,
Like
I mean,
on the enrollment.
I think my question is with these numbers, it's going to potentially lead to some people having some feelings on the direction the school should be going in. And so is that something that I don't think we should have a meeting just on that topic, but is that something best left to the time of finance or before you start budgeting for the next school year to be able to have some of that feedback already provided? So it can be used potentially at the time that the budgets are being created, rather than using the budget time as a time for people to object because of things such as the enrollment numbers. Is it best to solicit feedback as you start to head into budget season?
If I can speak to that, perhaps it's helpful, David, and I agree that the public needs to really understand the story behind the numbers and the context of that. And if I may, we're right now, our goal is to get our budget ready to wrap up to present the very first week of January. We have done preliminary staffing across the schools based on next year's number. Now, that being said, I think that, at the next board meeting, people that have heard this can make public comment about the numbers, but where it really does, the rubber meets the road is in the budget presentation as far as how are we looking to staff next year, keeping an eye to at least the next, like Mike said, 3 years where those numbers are the most solid. And as Tony said, as we move further along in not only the budget process, but the facilities optimization committee, all I keep doing and running through my heads, and I know the principals are doing the same, is what do these numbers translate into the configurations then that we need to look at as far as the facility optimization. And when we have those public forums, when people are speaking out, then I think that they will have more of a context around the numbers when they look at the different proposals, if I'm making sense. So I know tomorrow, just for the purposes of full transparency, the administrative team is going to meet with Tectron. They are the architects, and we have done preliminary questions. We asked them about their reports that they answered, and we've looked over that information, and then to have that kind of conversation about educational specifications that we think are important. Now, with the backdrop of these numbers, albeit some of them might not be as solid as we want, I think that as we progress, I am confident that there will be opportunities for people to comment and share. But we have to kind of figure out, like, there's a couple of other steps I think that we have to get a little further on in the process so that then those numbers are meaningful to the general public. I don't know if that was helpful.
It was. I just want to make sure that we don't find ourselves in a situation when the time comes that we're defending a budget because people haven't had an opportunity
Sure.
to share their thoughts on enrollment, right? So it's like the two things are heading towards each other, and if we can avoid them at the same time bubbling up, it's to our advantage. And then
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I have it's a related question more on the facilities though. So I don't know if you had a further thought on, soliciting or getting public comment on the enrollment.
One thing I just wanted to add about the budget process that maybe some of our newer members don't know is this. So we present a budget, but it still very much is a work in progress. And when we start working with the Board of Education, there are tweaks and revisions along the way. I guess I would say it's not necessarily this is it, this is what we want, but there will be times where you guys will ask more questions. People will probably share their thoughts to you that will turn out in questions to us that we need to clarify. And that is all built into the process to make sure that people do have a clear understanding, especially of the numbers, because I think the numbers in this budget are going to be so important because of the facilities work, as Tony said. It's going to impact it's going to impact the future plan, not only of the multi-year budgets, but the facilities.
Yeah, I think, David, in the budget process, though, there's an ample opportunity to actually discuss the impact of enrollment on the lower grade staffing. I mean, this is a big, it's sometimes painful, the discussion we have around everyone's view on enrollment in the lower grades and how that affects staffing. So I think there'll be ample opportunity to discuss that short term. And I think the budget process is the place to start, because it's not that it's just a sideshow. It is a big discussion topic around the lower grade enrollment and the implications of staffing. So it's not that it's brushed over. So I think there'll be ample opportunity for that. The longer term projections, I think, are going to be something that I think it becomes part of the longer term facilities work, because everyone has an opinion. Everyone's an amateur statistician when it comes to enrollment. And so everyone has a point of view on this. So, I think the best place to do it is in context of what this means for the future configuration of the campus. And so, I hear you, and I think it's got to be discussed, and there's got to be opportunity for the public to be engaged on the discussion. But I view the context comes in those two areas. And I think my view is we should probably wait for those discussions to happen.
Okay. And then the other part of my question was, because you brought it up, Tony, and I agree, being that the Facilities Optimization Committee is going to use this data, and being that Nasdaq and SLAM really don't agree with each other, how do you bridge that gap? Because that to me is going to be a problem.
I think it's listen, more data is better than less data. Okay. And I think we can find our way through this. Having one is leads to less of a discussion. It just is what it is, right? Now having two is going to require us to have a bit more of a discussion on how we approach this. I don't have an answer. I think we should probably at the next, maybe at the next public meeting, do a difference and discuss it a little bit. Lisa, I don't know if you have a view.
Well, what I was thinking is you're right. They are different, and then Mr. Zuba with his low, his medium, his high, Nasdaq. We did want to have two for that very reason, because the work is so important that we have to kind of figure out. But one of the things that will help guide our work is that, remember that you have recommendations for class size. And so when you do that, you also have to see where are the tipping points in each class based on the projections. And sometimes how off they are from each other, we'll have to really look at closely to see within the class guidelines how that how that plays out within the middle school philosophy of the teaming structure, how that would play out. Sometimes 6 or 7 in one class overall, based on the average, it might not. It's going to be challenging, and we have to look at it at that level, but it's not impossible to do.
Yeah.
And then we also have to consider, when you overlay that with the buildings, and where, if we were looking at a plan for where grades would fit, then there are also other, obviously some considerations based on the structure of the building, upstairs, downstairs, size, all of that, grade level. So there's a lot of moving pieces on this, and I can just say that we will really try to do the very best we can in fleshing it out as clearly as possible, so that the public does understand the work, the options, and what we eventually will recommend, because it's important.
Mm-hmm. Just looking, quickly doing a quick, looking at both of the presentations, you don't really know the difference between Nasdaq and SLAM in 1 year out. K-5 is 15 students, right? You don't know how 15 students in 6 grades are going to really make any difference to our staffing level. Until we actually look at it more closely, 2 years out, there are about 30 difference, and you don't really understand how that's going to affect anything until you really look at the data more closely.
I was going to say, I think, Lisa, you couldn't have said it any better as far as the numbers from Nasdaq and SLAM are the numbers, but you have classrooms, physical classrooms, and you have class sizes. And those are going to be the controlling factor. So I think that was really eloquently stated, because those are numbers that have to go in front, right? And then the enrollment is somewhat secondary to those numbers, because we want to maintain class sizes, and we want to have classrooms to put these class sizes into. So I think that's a really good explanation.
The other thing, just not to belabor the point, but so there's class size, but as Ms. Cavoni knows, at the high school, the other thing that's interesting to note is, if you have a difference between 9th and 12th grade, yes, that's a concern. But a difference between 11th and 12th, not so much, because 70% of our classes are mixed grade levels. And that's another thing that some people don't realize. You go into a particular class, like a Spanish 4 or a Spanish 5, and you can have anywhere from 10th, 11th, and 12th graders mixed in. So that can also be diluted when you look at, well, there's such a big drop at the high school. Yes, there is. And there are mixed grade level classes that we have to take into consideration. And, I take it very personally, this drop at the high school, maybe because I spent so many years there. What we also want to do is, and it is sort of anecdotal data, is look at the last 3 years. We can look in Power School at the students that withdrew, at the students that entered, and shout out to Ms. Saketa, who was texting me and showing me that the reasons are listed in Power School. So then we can go and say, okay, these people moved, but why did they move? And we know our families, K-12, we can also figure out that data to see, because I just can't believe, with Weston High School being, in my eyes, the #1 high school in the state, that there is going to be that kind of a drop. I would hesitate to think it's going to be that big, but maybe that's my bias.
That makes sense. And I think your explanation is one that we should actually carry forward with us, especially when there's questions about the enrollment. It's just not as simple as numbers. It's class sizes and physical classrooms. And at the high school level, it's a whole nother, because the classes are commingled. So I think that's really something that I hadn't really thought much about, which we should make
Yeah.
sure we don't lose sight of that as we move these
Yeah.
numbers forward.
Yeah, and I think that really is a important part of our budget discussion when we talk about staffing. And so, we'll circle back to that. And so, and I'll spend some time with Lisa to see how we want to do a comparison of the two in order to continue our discussion. Right. Anything else before we adjourn?
I would say just a special shout out to anyone that's watching. We did send out our new, our monthly district update and our school update today. And you will notice that we again are encouraging the public to please watch the recorded meetings or join them live. And there is a special link that will take you to all the committee meetings and our upcoming Board of Ed meetings. So we hope to see you there and, encourage your participation. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thanks, Lisa. With that, can I have a motion to adjourn?
I motion to adjourn.
Second?
Second.
Okay, great. Thank you.